College Place is a video library of noteworthy presentations, panel discussions, and lectures featuring guest speakers and faculty members, taped at one of the Milwaukee Area Technical College's 4 southeastern Wisconsin campuses. These are produced by students in the college's Associate's Degree program in television video production in coordination with Milwaukee Public Television.
News program in 1966, and he talked about what it felt like to be on the receiving end of racism. And after he said what he said, the next day he was pistol whipped by a white cop so badly that he was hospitalized. And several years later he was murdered, and we were told that he was murdered by a young black kid from the neighborhood who was he was about 21 when he shot my grandfather. And we were told that he was hired by a white cop to commit that murder. So what my grandfather said was radical for that time and for that place. And a lot of people, I think, wouldn't think that it was so radical. Because all he really said was, you know, sometimes I worry about my children. And when people call me the N-word, it makes me want to cry on the inside. And I wonder, what else can I do? But the town he was living in was so dangerous that even statements like that, statements that seem somewhat benign, put his life in danger. So let's learn a little bit about what that town was like. And I think this is on. Let's all hope for the best. Okay. So the piece that you saw that my grandfather was in was actually part of a longer 1-hour news special called Mississippi: A Self-Portrait, which aired in 1966, and then he died in '73. And all of those scenes that you saw collectively come from a film that I made about his life in 2012 called Booker's Place: A Mississippi Story, and that film premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival. And in July of that year, Dateline NBC did a 1-hour special about this story, and I'm currently writing a book called Searching for Booker Wright, which is being published by Simon & Schuster either at the end of this year or early next year. Let's see. So the town that he was living in had about 22,000 residents, and it was a cotton town. And it was in Greenwood, Mississippi was the town, and it was the county seat for Leflore County. And Greenwood is in the Mississippi Delta on the eastern edge. And in the 60s, it had a population of 22,000, and it was surrounded by plantations. So even though the town itself had a very small population, on the weekends, sometimes the population would double or get even greater because so many people would come in from plantations to buy goods, for entertainment, to go to the movies. And about their socioeconomic situation, Charles Payne has a great quote. He says, in the 1960s, 82% of Negro housing in Leflore County was substandard, which in the Delta could mean sub any human standard. Nevertheless, Negroes living in tar paper shacks with 1 or 2 light bulbs would regularly receive higher utility bills than white families in modern homes. So the national average for a family income at that time was $5,600. In Leflore, it was $5,200 if you were white. If you were black and living in Leflore, it was $1,400. So essentially, poverty in Greenwood for blacks was at epidemic proportions. I also learned about Greenwood's role in the civil rights movement. I learned that Emmett Till, the 14-year-old boy who was lynched, tortured, murdered for making a sound that someone deemed inappropriate at a white woman, that incident happened 8 miles north of Greenwood. So Money, where Emmett Till was murdered, was one of those plantation towns surrounding Greenwood. I also learned that in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a very lengthy letter to President Kennedy to talk about his concerns for Greenwood. The violence in Greenwood was enormous, and he was really fearful that if things weren't done soon to help the residents, the black residents of Greenwood, that they would stop being able to protest nonviolently and that they would turn to violence themselves because their lives were in such danger. My Byron de la Beckwith, the man who murdered Medgar Evers, was a prominent member of the Greenwood Society. He was in Greenwood the night that he killed Medgar Evers. He drove his car down to Jackson to commit that crime. Stokely Carmichael first said Black Power in Greenwood in 1966. And lastly, Greenwood was the national headquarters for a group called the White Citizens Council. And the White Citizens Council was supposed to be sort of like a nicer version of the KKK. They were made up of prominent doctors, lawyers, businessmen, politicians, and they would threaten violence. They oftentimes committed violence. But unlike the KKK, that was not their only tool. They also used economic reprisals. They would make sure that you lost your job if you tried to vote. They would make sure that you were evicted. Whatever career you had, there was a grocer who's the person who supplied him his goods began charging him triple what he had been charging him in the past. So they just made it very difficult to put food on the table for your family. And the White Citizens Council did something else. They created a newsletter, and depending on where you lived, the newsletter went by different names. So in some areas it was called a Delta Discussion, in some places it was called the Truth Bulletin, and in some places it was called Nocturnal Messenger. But regardless of the name, they were basically all the same. And right now I've got a sample of one that I'd like to read to you. And I want to say it does have the N word in it, which isn't a word that I tend to use in my life, but when I'm quoting someone, I like to say exactly what they said. I don't want to sugarcoat their language or give them a pass on the hurt that they committed. To those of you niggers who gave or give aid and comfort to this civil rights scum, we advise you that your identities are in the proper hands and you will be remembered. We know that the nigger owner of Collins Shoe Shop on Johnson Street entertained Martin Luther King when the big nigger came to Greenwood. We know of others, and we say to you, after the shouting and the plate passing and stupid demonstrations are over, and the imported agitators have all gone, one thing is sure and certain. You are still going to be niggers, and we are still going to be white men. So there was fear that was founded in truth in Greenwood. The reality was that it really wasn't safe to be black in Greenwood, and it really wasn't safe to be involved in the movement or to even have someone suspect that you were involved in the movement. It was common for members of the KKK or of the White Citizens Council to shoot into homes of people who were suspected of being involved in the movement, people who it was rumored had attended a meeting. So it didn't really take much to have your life changed simply because you lived in this town in that time. So when I made the film, I'd done all this research. I'd spent about 4 years doing research. And by the time that we'd gotten a crew together and we were going down to Greenwood, Mississippi to interview people, to meet with people, I was feeling pretty pissed off. I was really mad. And I wanted to find some people, and I knew that there were people who were still alive who had worked at the restaurant where my grandfather was a waiter, who had called him the N-word, who had treated him that way. And I wanted to meet those people. And something really interesting happened. One of the members of our production crew was able to get a man named Noel Davis to agree to meet with us. And Noel Davis was in his 80s in the summer of 2011, and he had been a president of the White Citizens Council. And for the life of me, I couldn't fathom why he would agree to meet with us. But I didn't really care, because I was going, I wanted to, well, I'm going to read a chapter from my book that sort of describes for you what I wanted to do. It's called Deconstructing a Racist. In the weeks leading up to my Greenwood trip, I was relishing the idea of sitting down and confronting someone who'd opposed the civil rights movement. In my mind, Noel Davis very well could have been one of the people who'd humiliated my grandfather at Lusco's. I had a whole host of questions I wanted to ask him that were fueled by curiosity and not a small amount of resentment. I viewed my meeting with Davis as if it were an opportunity to perform an autopsy of sorts. I was going to pry inside his mind and uncover the genesis of his racism. I planned to write about him, and in doing so, to paint a portrait of a man who would serve as a cautionary tale. I wanted to reach down into his memory and wrap a hand around the moment the seed of racism was planted. I was going to explore how that seed was watered, and then look into his eyes to see that seed fully grown. I was going to deconstruct a racist. When I arrived at Noel Davis's house, the first thing I noticed about him was his height. He was well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders, a sizable head, and a straight, strong stance despite his age. His gray eyes were constantly wet, and he had a deep voice that struck me as measured and concrete. His cheeks were thick and still held a blush. When he was listening, he would tilt his head to the side and lift a hand to smooth his hair down in what struck me as a youthful gesture. When he was speaking or searching for just the right word, he would rock back and forth on his heels with his large hands in his pockets. Davis was in his 80s, but somehow I had a sense of the boy he may have been before he learned to hate people who looked like me. It was only in his voice that I saw his age. His voice was thick, slow, a bit shaky, but lusciously Southern. He had that classic, beautiful drawl that made y'all and reckon and the delicate dropping of D's and T's seem right, as though that was how English was always meant to be spoken. The camera was turned on and a hush fell over the room. Even though there were 3 lighting technicians, 2 cameramen, a producer, and several researchers all huddled together between just a few couches, it was suddenly as if Raymond and Davis were in the room by themselves. After making small talk, Raymond asked him if he thought Greenwood had changed since he'd moved there in September of 1949. Davis responded, "I think the cultures in Greenwood are getting along somewhat better than they did. I had one that worked for me for 35 years. I had known him before I even hired him, and we got along just fine. We went through the movement in really good shape. We had no problem." He went on to talk about the economic situation in Greenwood today. "I don't see the work ethic I used to see. That's what brought the Mexicans in. See, they'll work. Most of our gins are working Hispanics now rather than," he paused, looking for the right word, "the people that already lived here." I stopped listening. I was afraid that I would stand up and scream at Raymond for not calling out Davis's blatant racism. I wanted to look at Davis, repeat his statements to him, then break them down and explain how dehumanizing they were. I clenched my fist, closed my eyes, and leaned back into the cushions of his couch and waited. I just wanted it to be over. I was looking towards my own moment with the racist. When the interview finally ended, members of our crew walked back and forth into and out of Davis's home to remove the equipment they'd brought in. I stood in the foyer waiting for everyone to leave so that I could do what I had come to do. It took about 30 minutes, but then Noel Davis and I were alone. We stood together, engaging in small talk. I was only half there because the rest of me was examining him, trying to figure out how to begin, how to delve into my provocative questions. Suddenly his voice changed, and with a hint of authority, he said, "Come sit in this chair." "What?" I asked. "Come sit in this chair," he repeated. I looked around. For the first time, I let myself take in his front room. The carpet was a light, pale color, possibly green, and free of evidence that anyone had ever walked on it. Furniture was smartly placed around the room in a delicate balance. On the far wall, there was a built-in bookshelf under which stood a beautiful, well-polished piano. There was a medium-sized settee with plump, comfortable-looking cushions that had a simple painting of pastel images hanging over it. The dark wood coffee table that stood in the center of the room seemed faint and feminine. On top of it were several picture books about historic Mississippi homes. This was a room for sipping tea in petticoats and starched trousers. In one corner stood Davis, pointing at a leather, beige-colored, futuristic-looking chair. It was long, slender, and had lots of buttons on it. "It belonged to my wife," he said. No one sat in it since she passed 4 years ago. I took a deep breath. In spite of the powerful air conditioner that cooled his home, I could feel the warmth of the Mississippi sun sliding in under the door, finding me, making me sweat. Come on, sit in it. You can turn it on, he persisted. I walked over to the chair, bent over and sat down, but that wasn't enough. Lean back in it. Here, take this remote. You can make it move along your back. Look at it, he said, holding the remote in front of my face. You can make it massage your back, your legs, and so forth. He went on and on and on and on like that. And if you want a deeper massage, push that button there. He kept talking. He talked about the chair, about Mississippi, about the weather, and in spite of a hint of unnamed desperation, I found him to be genuinely engaging. Warm and subtly funny, Noel Davis was good company. I found myself thinking about things he'd said earlier in the day. Like when he told Raymond that all of his children had moved away. They had all left the state of Mississippi to live their lives outside of the Delta. Suddenly, I felt startled, as though a loud noise had abruptly awakened me. I began to recognize something in Davis's words, his movements, the quick glances he made in my direction. Somehow I knew him, not from Frank's film in '66, but from somewhere else. I felt the nagging of déjà vu. I was certain that this was not our first encounter because he was remarkably familiar to me. I had the sense that I knew more about Noel Davis than what he was showing. There was a piece of him buried beneath his exterior that I was certain I'd seen before. When I realized what it was, how I knew Davis, I couldn't believe how long it had taken me to see it, to see him. I shut my eyes as if not looking at him could make it not real. I tightened my fists, wanting to rewind, to go back for just a few seconds before so that I could undo the knowing. But there was no going back. Davis was still talking, but now he was watching me. I smiled so that he wouldn't think anything was wrong, and I wondered if he recognized me too. Did he know that we were both connected by something deeper than race? That we were both the members of the same tribe, fellow countrymen who had experienced the soul-shattering truth of solitude? Not the kind of alone that can be cured with an outing with friends. Davis and I had both experienced the sort of solitude that generates a silence of such magnitude that it leaves a crack in the world, a cut through which thick, awkward hope of connection bleeds out, covering every encounter in humiliation. The two of us were connected by a basic human experience. We both knew what it felt like to be lonely. In that moment, the girl who was looking for someone to blame and the man who just didn't want to be alone were linked in spite of ourselves. I knew then why he had agreed to the meeting. It would mean that for a few hours one morning, he could defy the silence. He would not have to be alone. Now he was sitting on the settee, calling me over to look at picture books of Mississippi. Apparently he had changed jobs. No longer was he the chair salesman, now he was working at a visitor's bureau, explaining all that I needed to understand about Mississippi in order to get the most out of my trip and to glimpse the beauty of this place that brought him such pride. I played along, not knowing what else to do. I feigned captivation, nodded vigorously, giggled when it seemed appropriate, and wondered how I would ever leave. This man, who had been on the wrong side of history during a critical time for blacks, seemed to not want this particular black girl to leave. His loneliness was almost palpable. He wanted company, no matter what shade of brown it came in. In pursuit of company, Davis was tireless. One story led to another, which led to another, which led to another, and so on and so on and so on. I felt anxious. I sensed that the only way I'd be able to leave was awkwardly. Finally, I stood up in the middle of one of his stories, Abruptly, he stopped talking and looked up at me with wide, confused eyes. Then, like a curtain falling, realization quickly moved down his face, from his eyes to his blushing cheeks, and on to his lips, which said, of course, I've kept you too long." We exchanged warm goodbyes with lots of hand-holding, smiling, slowly walking towards the door, more shaking of hands, nodding of heads, and finally more smiling. As I passed over the threshold, I was momentarily blinded by the Delta sun. I turned my eyes to the ground and made my way to the car, where I opened the door and then looked back and waved one more time. He stood there, watching me from his doorway, and there he remained while the driver pulled away. I watched him until we rounded a bend and I couldn't see him anymore. As the car moved through the quiet streets past the thoughtfully decorated homes, I looked down at my lap at my empty hands. Neither of us got what we wanted. Instead of answers, I just had different questions, and Davis was left alone again. I thought that I should cry for him, but I could not. He was tortured. Whatever punishment Noel Davis may have deserved for who he was all those years ago was being slowly doled out to him without any help from me. So, my journey started out as an opportunity to kind of have a reckoning for these people who I believed had hurt my grandfather. And in the end, I found people, not so much Noel Davis, but lots of other people who he'd waited on their entire childhoods, and they just remembered him as this great guy they'd come into the restaurant and Booker would play high-low with them. He'd pick him up and lift him up high and drop him down low, and he would sing high-low when he was doing it. And I know that those people failed to really see him, but their failure to see him was not born of malice. Don't get me wrong, there were the cross burners, there were the lynchers, but there were also the people in the middle of the road who didn't do anything to stop it. And what I learned is that a lot of those people just didn't pay attention. And I think a lot about the culture that we live in today. And a lot of times people like to say, well, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. Which to me means, okay, then you don't see the things afflicting people of color. You don't see the problems in some of these communities. You don't see that the jails are full of people of color. I think that the call for us is to notice, and the call for other people is to notice, to pay attention. But at the same time, I think it's real to hurt. You know, my grandfather was so eloquent, and he described so beautifully what it felt like to be humiliated when someone calls you the N-word. And I think by the time that he finished his talk, he wasn't over it. You know, and I think sometimes people expect you to just get over it, but I always think, well, would you say that to someone who was raped? Would you say just get over it? It's in the past. You know, no one has the right to tell anyone else how long something should hurt for. But at the same time, I think that when we encounter people who have bias, it's painful, but there's also opportunity there. And if we can be strong enough to know them and to get to know them and to show them our humanity, to show them the parts of ourself beneath the color, I think that we can affect true change. So that's all. Thank you. Questions, comments? Yes. Well, here's the thing. So the party line at that time was that blacks were happy. And while there were a lot of news stories, and sometimes you would see blacks trying to peacefully protest, and then they would have water, you know, put on them. You rarely saw blacks, unless they were employed by the NAACP or something, saying anything besides, we're happy. And in that film, there were two other blacks who were interviewed, and they basically said, well, one guy said, they were both sharecroppers. One guy said, the farmer who owns my plantation is a great guy and I'm happy. And there was another woman who said that she was living in deep poverty, but that it was her own fault because her husband wouldn't work hard. People were really afraid to even say, I'm not happy with the way things are. And there were places in the country you could do that and not risk death. Greenwood was not one of those places. So what he said was, and you have to remember too, he worked at Lesko's 25 years, and people allowed themselves to believe they had friendship with him. His white customers believed they had friendship with him. He went on the national news and he mimicked them. He imitated their voices. He said, this is how they talk to me. And when he finished reciting the menu, he said, I only talk this way because my customers want me to. So they felt mocked and betrayed, but they also felt like, you're not supposed to say that you're not happy. That's not what we've allowed you to say. Sure. I'll just call on you if you don't raise your hand.
I enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
I was born in Greenwood, Mississippi. I'm just familiar with the situation that took place.
Really? Do you still have family there?
I do. My mother lived there. She was some years of age. She's familiar with the area at that time. Interestingly, there are a lot of places in Mississippi still today, Greenwood, Mississippi, that you still can't enter into. A lot of people are not aware of that, but it's still ongoing and alive today. And your being here definitely lives on the telling of his story. And I think more people should be aware of that story and how America itself should be ashamed of itself in the way that we have done things over the years, and today have not made much progress. So I just thank you for where you're at and what you're doing.
Thank you for coming. I love it. Yes.
I'm trying to, I saw Booker's place before I came. But what I see is that I'm trying to figure out how to interject. I'm just trying to figure out how to interject, like, certain places in this country, it's not conducive for African Americans to live there, at least not in the And what I see is that to a degree, to a great degree, that a lot of African Americans suffer from Stockholm syndrome. That's what I see. Because why would you want to be in a situation where it's like, and it's sad.
Do you want to explain Stockholm syndrome?
Stockholm syndrome, and a lot of people suffer from it. And when you try to explain it to them, they don't see it. But it's when someone was a captive. I guess it was derived from a situation where someone was taken captive in a hostage situation. And what happened is the person that was held captive develops a sense of empathy for their captive. I see a lot of African American community that's what happens. If you're in a situation or area where, it's violent like that. I'm looking at Jasper, Texas, where they killed a guy, cut his eyelids off and said that it was a suicide. And then later they came back and said that it was drug cartels that did it. And it was all because he was married. And at the same time, it's interesting that he was married to a Caucasian woman. But like I said, I look at things because with life and being here in this country, which is one of the best countries in the world, I have to admit, we do things here and we are allowed to do things here that other countries can't do. But at the same time, I see that certain pockets of this nation that it's not conducive for African Americans to be. And I know generation after generation after generation living in that area, you kind of become accustomed to it and think that this is the way that I'm supposed to live. And you go You have slaves that was actually on their slave master's side, because in their mind they couldn't understand the concept of what freedom meant and what that the whole war was about, or allegedly about, because it was more so economic than anything.
You know, the same thing in the movement, there were people who called it, black people who called it that mess.
Right, exactly.
They thought it was sure to pot and to make people now and believe it.
Because they're used to things being a certain way, and they're in fear of change. But yeah, the concept of Stockholm syndrome is just
I have a question about in one of the clips, it showed the discrepancy of what whites made versus blacks at that time. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I mean, yeah, it was amazing. I mean, there was a man who ended up becoming very fertile in the movement, and I cannot think of his name right now. A black man, but he'd gone to war, and he came back home, and he was struck by the poverty in the Delta. And he talks about how he went into a home to visit a family, and there were 14 children in the home, half naked, and there wasn't a single bed in the house, and they were burning cotton stalks to keep warm. It's difficult to even fathom the level of poverty. I know my father lived in Money, where Emmett Till was taken, and his mother was a full-time sharecropper, and she often had to keep her children home from school to help work the fields, or else the farmer would fire her. And if she was fired, then she was homeless and unemployed at the same time. But she, you know, sharecropping, I mean, I think most of us know that most sharecropping systems were corrupt. At the end of the year, you would settle out, and they would tell you, they would give you less than what you really had earned. So you really couldn't work hard enough to lift yourself out of that to get a better life. But she would go down to the road and pick something called pepper grass, which grew wild on the side of the road, and she would boil it, and that was their dinner at night. And she would sometimes have leftover potatoes or, you know, this and that, but that was what they ate. My dad remembers he would chew on gravel because she would try to clean it, but she couldn't always get all the gravel off. My mom's family had a garden, and they, year-round, I mean, they tended that garden. They would, at least a couple hours every morning, the 5 siblings would work in the garden because that was their food source. If they did not tend their garden, they could starve. And it's heart-wrenching. A lot of blacks were part of a surplus food program. So the federal government provided food for poor people in the Delta. And the LaFleur County supervisors, many of whom were members of the Citizens Council, in response to the civil rights movement and sort of just as payback, they decided to stop those shipments. And historians have said that 27,000 people literally began to starve. One of the things I realized being in the Delta, because in some ways you're in the middle of nowhere. If you're poor, your neighbor's poor, your neighbor's poor, your neighbor's poor, there's no food. And I honestly believe that there are homeless people in major cities who eat better than poor people in the Delta, because they can at least find food from a trash can. They can eat something that one of us has left behind. But in the Delta, if you are surrounded by poverty and there's nothing growing and there's nothing, all the land is owned by someone else, so you can't really even go grow something. I mean, there is no food. It's intense. Yes?
As far as wages and unfair taxes and utilities, that goes on today right here in Milwaukee. Your insurance and all that. So that's,
Wow.
What did she say?
She was discussing the disparity in how sometimes blacks in the 60s were charged more for their electric bills, even though they clearly weren't using as much electricity. And she was expressing that she sees the same types of behaviors occurring here in Milwaukee, that blacks are charged more for car insurance and different things like that.
Address makes a difference.
Your address makes a difference, it does. Yeah, it still blows my mind that schools are... Yeah, it blows my mind that schools are funded based on property tax. So if your house is worth a lot, then your school gets a lot of money. If your house isn't worth very much, then your school doesn't get very much money. So there's really no way to...
Or if your house is worth anything, and you live in a neighborhood like mine, where it's empty field, and a house, and school is nothing. Well, actually, they'll close down the school.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, that's their remedy.
Yes.
I have a lot of different questions, but I'm going to try to squeeze as many as I can to make the most impactful questions as I can. First question that I have is that, you know, when I watched your grandfather's story and your documentary, the first thing that came to my mind, other than my experience, because I also too used to be a waiter and so on and so forth, and I got a story that can go very parallel to something that's that I related humanly to what your father had done. And but I'll try to see if I can squeeze that in after I ask my one of many questions. My first question I want to ask is that, do you think in the movie Forrest Gump, where they had, and this came to me just when I was sitting here, was in reflection to the documentary of some of the things in which your father read off the menu of how different foods was being served in that movie, that was some form of an emulation to the documentary that was given in the history text by the broadcaster who had presented the story to begin with. That's one question that I ask of you. Do you think that there's some similarities in the way that role was depicted in the movie has any close relations to your grandfather's story?
You know, well, what my grandfather did, a lot of people would call it a type of minstrel. You know, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, many whites were first introduced to blacks at all because they didn't have blacks in their community, especially if they lived in the northern states. Many whites were first introduced to blacks in musical theater. And they would either have, sometimes it was actual black people, but usually it was whites in blackface, and they would do a minstrel show. And they would basically try to epitomize the jolly, ever-happy, dim-witted plantation slave. And so I think that Booker was doing a minstrel because that's what his clientele wanted. I don't remember, I saw Forrest Gump. I don't remember how they did his menu.
Well, it was the guy who sold it.
Oh, Bubba Gump shrimp. Okay, okay. I'll have to go back and watch it.
And I just want to personally say that it's a pleasure to meet someone whose ancestral linkage had a direct game-changing event that brought forth a lot of different, how can I say, well-rounded, well-needed, well-shedded light on situations and circumstances that was going on in that area. And I just want to say I thank you, your grandfather, because it's pivotal moments like that that really over the full umbrella or the gamut of what black people suffer and go through, that people step on the front line knowing all of the severities that come with what they do for the well-being of people. And I just personally want to thank, you know, his lineage as well as, you know, the legacy that you're tracing out of him.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Being a part that has helped move us as a people forward. And I just personally want to say thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you for connecting and listening.
It's so many questions that I have because I'm very in tune with the need of progressional movement for our people. And the one thing that, you know, I can say that makes it hard for me to wrap my mind around, because when your grandfather was killed and I was only 2 years old, and as I listened to the story, it kind of really nudged a part of me to say how sleep America is to its present circumstances.
Yes.
Because we're not really that far out of these situations and circumstances, because the people actually don't know that these are old habits that's hard to break. And I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but it's just so much that I have to ask of. But I can just say that in my youngful time as a waiter, I can recall a situation I was serving a bunch of affluent people, and this guy was so arrogant in the sense of the word that he began to choke on his meal. He was so prideful and choking on his food that he wouldn't choke among his white peers. So he got up and left out of the room, and I knew right away that there was something wrong with this guy, that there was something really going on.
Yeah.
So I followed him out into the hallway, and this guy was straight up choking.
Wow.
And I had learned the Heimlich maneuver when I was in high school. Never knowing this guy, just the humanity that I related to within the story when you sat with the guy who you said you spoke of in the chapters in your book. You know, humanly I related to him. So I ran up behind him, grabbed him, the Heimlich maneuver, you know, and a couple of times. And I believe I saved his life, to be honest with you. And in return, at that frail moment right there, he couldn't find the humanity to turn around to say thank you for what I had done for him. He wiped his mouth, he straightened out his coat, fixed his tie, went back in, and sat back amongst who he felt not even decent enough to choke in front of, but behind the scenes on the black side, you know, I saved this man's life, and it was, and I just can't, I mean, I got stories, but I just can't imagine the things that your grandfather went through at that time, because the circumstances was every day probably for him, because this is what he done to provide for his family. And for him to make such a bold step forward in that time, in that era, I can't even begin to say how important that was. And I mean, my mind has so many questions that can flood.
Well, no, I appreciate you sharing what you've shared. Thank you.
This thing, but you know, it's just, I'm just glad to, and I hope you're the most successful with what you're trying to push forward.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
And I just want to say thank you, and I'll just end it there.
Okay,
So
well, I'll be around after. Thank you very much. Yes.
I would just like to congratulate you also on bringing this alive, and I just kind of going back in time. I had a chance to work in the education system in Milwaukee Public School, and we had an education tour to the Capitol, somewhat pertaining to this event, and it was picture shown on our education tour. But the whole thing being, in the picture they was just speaking about things similar to what's been brought out tonight.
Okay.
And, in the past, the focus seemed to have been on the no more of just going back and, well, just community environments now. We had a community forum here this past weekend, and what some of the essence of what I've seen what seems to sync with me is just we're working as a people on a humanitarian spirit level. In other words, we're working in unity together to grow more and more. It's just life goes ahead. We capitalize on what we have and let that give us a high step up and just continue on to the rest of your life.
I agree with that. I absolutely agree. You know, I think, of course, I think it's important to look back, to know what we've come from, to understand the past. I do think sometimes people can look so closely at it, myself included, that we just get angry and it's all that we see. So I appreciate that thought about moving forward and capitalizing on what we can do well. Yeah, it's good. Thank you. Yes?
Earlier in the day, I watched your presentation and you kind of made a connection to some of the other things that were happening around that time, Emmett Till, and can you kind of incorporate all of those different things you talked about this morning?
I think I did that tonight too. I did. I talked about how Emmett Till, Stokely Carmichael. Did I do that in this room? Yes. Yes. So Greenwood was sort of just a hotbed for civil rights activity, even though a lot of people don't realize it, don't learn about it in school. It's interesting how we can educate. You know, I think even about Rosa Parks. You know, when I was in school, I learned that Rosa Parks was how the movement began. but most civil rights experts will say that it was really Emmett Till's murder that began the movement. And if you think about it, it makes a lot more sense than that, this little old woman saying, I won't give up my seat, to be the impetus for a nationwide movement. She did that in December of 1955. Emmett Till was murdered in August of 1955, and the photograph of his bloated, destroyed body ran in Life magazine and Jet magazine. So blacks and whites all over the country saw this, and 10,000 people went to his funeral, which was an open casket. So, yes? If Booker came back to this time, would he say that there are a lot of similarities to what was happening in Greenwood, or would he say that it's different? I wish I knew. That is a great question. I have to say, if he came back, I think the first thing I would ask him is, where did you get your time machine? And maybe the next thing I would ask him would be, you might want to go back to the day you were murdered and deal with that first, and then we can hang out. I don't know. I get what you're saying. Of course. Absolutely. Well, it's more systemic. Now we have a lot more, we have systems of racism now. And a lot of, there's this book called The New Jim Crow. And, she talks a lot in that book about how we went to war on drugs and war on crime, but even though at that time, and studies have shown that black people or Hispanic people don't use drugs more than whites, which most people don't believe that because of the way it's been projected in the media. But the war on drugs and the war on crime was really a war on neighborhoods that were neighborhoods of color. And what happens after you have been in prison, even if it was, not just for smoking pot, but, for smoking, for not these horrible crimes, you can't vote. You have to check that you've been imprisoned on every job application. I mean, it really creates a lifestyle that's very similar to what it was like in Jim Crow times. I mean, you can't change your representative, so you don't have representation yourself, and people legally cannot hire you because you've been in prison, because you have a record, which is, I legally can say I'm not going to hire you because of your color, because of your sexuality. So I don't know what Booker would say. Unfortunately, as much as I've studied his life, and I do feel like I love him, I never met him. I can tell you what I would say is I think a lot of things have changed, but I think in some ways it's more difficult because back then people who had racial bias wore white sheets. And I think that right now a lot of times we have bias, but I do think a lot of times it's hidden bias. I've been reading a lot about this field of study. It's called implicit bias, and researchers have figured out that our minds take in so much data, all of us. If you're human, you have a heart, your mind's take in tons of data. And in order to not overwhelm your mind, but in order to also help you be able to use that data effectively, your mind makes categories. So if you walk into a room and you're looking for a door, you want to go through this room, you need a door, you walk in and you walk past a chaise lounge, a stool, a chair, a couch, and a bench. Your mind is not going to say lounge, stool, couch, bench. Your mind's not going to do all of that. Your mind's going to make categories. Your mind will say, those are all places to sit, I need a door. Okay, that's how your mind works. So a gazillion years ago, if I was, one of our, ancestors who lived in a place that didn't have a door that locked, and I'm walking out in the fields and I see someone, I need to instantly know, is that person from my tribe? Are they safe? How can I look at this person and know if I'm okay to be with them? Do I need to get my guard up? Do I need to get do I need to get out of here? So the idea of looking at people and putting them in categories, some of it has nothing to do with morals, nothing to do with values, nothing to do with what we believe. It's how we were designed. And I'll tell you, researchers have found that we all have bias. Every single person in this room has bias. And what's unfortunate is that most of our bias is hidden from us. So I might say, I have no problem with gay people. I have no problem with gay marriage. Love who you want to love. Yvette, would you like to go to that restaurant owned by Mr. Gay so-and-so? No, I don't want to eat there. So I like gay people. I don't know that I have a bias. However, what researchers have found is that in our daily lives, unless we're aware of our bias, we are more likely to live our lives according to the bias that's hidden even from us. So what does that mean? Who makes the systems? Who makes the police system? Who makes the court systems? People with hidden bias. So we live in a society that's made by broken people, so we create systems in this society that are broken systems. So built into our systems, built into our laws is bias, in my opinion. Yes?
You know, I would say the first thing that your granddad would see in regards to the question that the lady spoke of, the first thing that I say that he would see is that the crime that's being perpetuated against African Americans is no longer whites but other African Americans. That would be the most prominent thing I would think he would see.
I don't think that was so different actually in the 70s. He was killed by a black man. I think what's interesting.
It was orchestrated allegedly
by a white cop, yes. But one of the reasons that the crime that led to his death wasn't questioned more during that day was because those types of crimes were common. What's different is that because black life was so devalued during that time and in that place, if a black man killed another black man, he did not serve a long sentence. They didn't have mandatory sentences or, it was, wasn't as big of a deal. But if a black man killed a white person, they were lucky to get to the courthouse and not be lynched beforehand.
Now, one thing, I can't speak on the 70s in regards to that, because I was born in 74.
Me too.
The point that I'm trying to make is, and maybe this is just because, I wasn't in that time frame, but what I see is that I believe that black nationalism was far more prominent than it is today. Black consciousness was far more prominent
Absolutely.
than it was then as it is today. Mm-hmm. So that's why my bias would have me believe that the crimes are more profound or greater in number today than against blacks, black on black crimes greater today than it was in 1970. That's just my bias.
I have two thoughts about that. I would say always do your research, look at the numbers, but I do completely believe, I agree with you. One of the things that was very shocking to me that I found when I went to Greenwood, because I just assumed anyone black living in the US would say the civil rights movement was a good thing, integration was a good thing, but what I found is that a lot of black people in Greenwood and other towns like Greenwood actually feel that they lost both their social and their economic identity when they integrated. And the business, the economic loss occurred in part, like in Greenwood, there was a town called Johnson Street. So again, all these blacks from plantations all around Greenwood would come in to Johnson Street. And it was the farthest north they were allowed to go in town, but it was also the street that had tons of black businesses. Shoe shops, Collins Shoe Shop on Johnson Street, we heard from Delta Discussion. Places to buy hair products, restaurants, and they were owned by black people. So if you were young, you'd walk down the street seeing black business owners, black people from all walks of life, and you lived in this hub of black culture. And my mom talks about not really ever feeling discriminated against until the few times a year that she had to leave that hub. Maybe there was a product that she needed where she had to go to the white side of town. And then they would say, keep your eyes down, don't look like you're insolent, don't. But other than that, she just felt like everything was fine. She didn't really know. Let me finish, okay? So what happened was a lot of, when integration occurred, You had blacks saying, wow, I can go anytime I want to a white store and spend whatever I want at any hour of the night as long as they're open. You did not have whites saying, now I can go to Bubba Gump Shrimp down on the south side, okay? So in Greenwood, at least, a lot of those black business owners began to feel the squeeze. They were losing business. So many of them moved. They moved to Chicago. They moved to LA. They just moved out so that they could provide for their families. And they left behind the blacks who'd been working as sharecroppers. But every year, people were inventing more and more efficient ways to work in the fields. So before, you might need 100 hands, 100 live people working your plantation, where today you might need 6. So you had these, so now you have the people who were used to working with their hands, the laborers, don't have jobs, don't have the business acumen to start their own business or the clientele, and they're left in this town. And that is what's left there. So that's sort of how a lot of blacks feel that they lost their economic identity. In terms of their social identity, that sort of goes back to not having that hub, but also a lot of black children had gone to schools that definitely were underfunded, but it was all their peers were black and their teacher was black. And then they go to white schools where it's 1 or 2 white kids in the class, or black kids in the class with a white teacher. They don't see anyone in their community like them, anyone at school like them, or any leaders, because the principal, the teachers, the cafeteria, they're all white. So I think I agree with that of course integration was a great idea. I think that there has been a loss of consciousness. There's a different level than there was then.
So could we give her a warm round of applause? Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.